The following program is made possible in part by the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area.
10-year-old Jenny and her sister Sarah have seen their mother for the last time. Sold for 100 British pounds, they belong to a distant relative of America's first president. They are Washingtons now, on a 3-month journey to their new home on our young country's western frontier, the state of Tennessee. With a life of servitude ahead of her, Jenny will watch her children and grandchildren labor to build one of the wealthiest plantations in the United States. Though Sarah will die a slave, Jenny will spend the last few years of her life as a free woman. But the blood required to end her bondage, and that of millions like her, will not be shed for another 60 years.
When I was a small boy, 5 or 6 years old, every Sunday just about after church, my maternal grandfather would take me for a ride out in the country. And often we would pass the entrance gate to Wessington, and my grandfather would slow down or stop and say, "That's Washington, that's where your grandmother's family came from."
Beginning with Jenny's long walk from Virginia, generations of John Baker's family spent their lives here, working the rich Robertson County soil, not because it was home, and not by choice. While just a child himself, John would answer the call to tell their stories. What would become his life's work began with the discovery of an old photograph in a middle school textbook.
When I was in the 7th grade, we used a social studies textbook called Your Tennessee, and I spotted a photograph of 4 individuals who had formerly been enslaved. And for some reason, I seemed drawn to this photograph, and I looked at it each time I would go to class thinking they resembled individuals that I'd seen before. And I learned later from my grandmother that 2 of them were her grandparents, Emmanuel and Henny Washington, who had been enslaved at Wessyngton Plantation. So I was immediately fascinated right then. I couldn't wait to get back to school to tell my classmates that my great-great-grandfather and mother's picture was in our social studies textbook. Some of them believed me, some didn't. So it dawned on me what my grandfather really meant, that my family's history went back there some 200 years.
John was determined to learn all he could about his ancestors. When a relative told him that descendants of the original owners still lived at Wessington, he contacted the family. John discovered that just a few years earlier, the plantation records had been donated to the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville, which was soon to become his home away from home. Teenage curiosity soon turned into obsession. John would spend the next 30 years combing through thousands of documents and photographs and interviewing dozens of descendants, culminating in his book, The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation.
During slavery, most plantation owners would have had to have kept these type records. It's just that few of them survived. And Wessington happens to be one of the most documented in the South, I would say.
Wessyngton Plantation is very distinctive. Not only was it one of the largest in Tennessee, all the records survived. So unlike a lot of plantations that we look at, we can give a fairly full picture of what slavery was like.
That later generations kept all of those documents is truly remarkable. But what I also think is important is that the oral traditions of the enslaved members of the Wessyngton Plantation were preserved as well.
I was very fortunate. When I started my research, there were probably 20 to 25 individuals who were children or grandchildren of former Wessington slaves. So after I started interviewing some of these people, I became as interested in their family histories as I was my own. So that's how I ended up spending 30 years of research. Some people say, "You mean it takes 30 years to trace your ancestry?" And I said, "No, it takes 30 years to trace 300 people's ancestry."
300 people. 300 human beings. During Wessington's heyday as the largest tobacco plantation in America, nearly 300 African Americans were forced under constant threat of brutal punishment or separation from loved ones through sale to keep the lucrative operation going.
Never will forget that slavery was an economic activity. That was a reason for slavery. I'm not sure that the masters understood or appreciated the degree of compassion that African American people felt for each other. That's a part of that subhuman fixture or identity of slavery. The master class had to believe that. It would have been too hard on one's soul or conscience to understand that you were treating loving and human and compassionate individuals like slaves.
There are many slave bills of sale in the Washington family collection starting in 1801 up to 1843. So I was able not only to trace my ancestors and the others at Wessington, I was able to trace where they came from before they got to Wessington.
Whereas I, Micah Jablow, hath bargained, sold, and delivered to Joseph Washington 2 Negro girls named Jenny and Sarah, and in consideration of the sum of £100, for which title I warrant and defend against all claims that can be produced against the above-named gentlemen for the said Negroes.
Young Jenny had helped carve Wessington out of the Tennessee wilderness, carrying clay from a nearby creek for bricks to build the mansion, in which she would spend her life as a servant.
Her childhood had ended when she arrived there. She'd be expected to put in a full day in the kitchen, in the laundry, and maybe, especially during certain times of the year, even doing some agricultural work, especially when it's harvest time. So it's all about investment, and she was a good investment.
It was generally advantageous for slave owners to purchase children, particularly young female children, because of their great childbearing potential. Of course, the children of any such purchases would eventually belong to the slave owner, and so this kind of purchase would have long-term profitability.
By age 16, Jenny began contributing to her master's wealth with her own flesh and blood. While slave weddings were not legally binding, she married a slave named Godfrey from a neighboring farm. Off-plantation or broad marriages were quite common, but often lonely, as visitations had to be approved by owners. The Old English name Wessington, later changed to Washington, dates back more than 500 years before a wealthy Virginia tobacco farmer by that name purchased 60 acres in Middle Tennessee.
This gentleman is Joseph Washington, and he was born in Southampton County, Virginia, July 7, 1770. He first came to Robertson County in 1796. On his first visit, he went to the home of his cousin, Colonel Archer Cheatham. At that time, this little girl was a baby, small enough to be carried in the arms. So he being a bachelor, someone asked him when he was going to get married. And he said, well, I'll just wait for this little girl to grow up and I'll marry her, which is what he did in 1812 when he was 42 and she was 16, which her father was the wealthiest man in the county, so that's probably helped that.
Wessington had grown to just over 1,000 acres by 1812, with a slave population of 25. But Joseph Washington's land holdings would continue to expand for many years to come, as would the need for labor. Jenny's husband, Godfrey, was purchased by the Washingtons for $800 in 1820, bringing the total number of slaves to 44. He and Jenny would have 9 children in all.
That's one of the great tragedies of slavery. It doomed successive generations to servitude. But along with that knowledge came a feeling that you had a responsibility and a duty to raise people to be able to withstand that experience and to, even if it's only internally, to triumph over it. Jenny becomes the founding member of a very important family at Wessington, and she becomes a real matriarch and leader of that community.
She obviously was a person who had the kind of character, the kind of strength of personality that made her suited for that particular role. It's a strategy used to bring as much cohesion to a slave community and to a particular slave family as circumstances allowed. That's not at all unusual to find women and men who played that kind of role, sometimes even for persons who were not blood related. She's also a source of continuity. She has a memory of what it was like living in Virginia. She remembered the trip, she remembered the travel. She knew that there was a world beyond Robertson County, Tennessee.
Much of Wessington's growth and business success is attributed to Joseph's son, George Augustine Washington. When the enterprising young man began taking over the operation in the late 1830s, the plantation covered more than 4,300 acres, requiring 86 slaves to run it. During the decade following Joseph's death in 1848, Wessington expanded to more than 13,000 acres, with land values skyrocketing from $20,000 to $250,000. And although he had stopped purchasing slaves in 1842, George A. Washington had become the largest slaveholder in Tennessee, with 274 African Americans in bondage. The sprawling estate was virtually self-sufficient, known across the country for the quality of its many exports, including a variety of produce, hams, and brandy.
The scale of Wessington, the sheer size of all the plantation operations, the sheer size of the enslaved labor force meant that it was really more like looking at an entire village. So you had every possible skill level represented. It meant that yes, you had many field hands, but you also had enslaved people performing highly skilled kinds of jobs. It allowed them to have a greater degree of specialization. And that's what made the plantation work. Another part of what made that work was the work that enslaved women did on the plantation in terms of domestic production. So being able to cultivate and then process all of the food needed to keep everyone fed, the textile production, keeping everyone clothed on the plantation. That was work that enslaved women performed under the supervision often of the plantation mistress. And that also is what made this a viable economic operation.
George's wife Jane and his mother Mary oversaw much of the day-to-day operations at Wessington, maintaining detailed journals of every activity.
In the livestock collar and basket book, you can see where Jane made notations where some slaves were whipped because they had lost their basket or turned in their basket in poor condition. I haven't seen such documents showing how much managerial duty the women slaveholders had, and they were directly involved with the discipline.
There's been a general fuss among the Negroes arising out of some lie Emily said Lavinia had told upon Joe. Not content with quarreling at Lavinia's house, they came on the hill, which ended in Jim, Lavinia, Joe, and Emily being whipped. The chastisement brought down their tempers, and all is now calm.
Physical punishment was not at all unusual or infrequent on slave plantations. Fear of violence and the use of violence, of whipping and other kinds of corporal punishment was actually integral and intrinsic to the whole system of slavery. Even in situations and arrangements that appeared humanitarian, there was always hovering over those arrangements the threat of violence.
That threat became a reality for Wessington slaves found participating in religious gatherings. Several of Joseph Washington's former neighbors in Virginia were killed during Nat Turner's infamous slave rebellion, which may have led to Wessington's strict ban of the practice.
Grandma Sarah told us that prayer meetings had to be held in secret on the plantation, and that slaves put overturned kettles and pots at the doors to muffled the sound of praying and singing. Grandma Sarah had seen slaves whipped, and salt and straw was rubbed in the wounds if they were caught praying for their freedom. The slaves would be held by other slaves, and others would be summoned to observe. Yet, she said this still didn't stop them from holding the meetings.
This is a list of Wessington rebels. These are individuals who ran away from the plantation. They attacked overseers. They pretended to be sick. They were told to go to work. They refused to go. And these are individuals from 1838 up to the Civil War who ran away from the plantation, and it states how long they were out, where they were captured, and so forth.
That was their rebellion against slavery. They ran away, and there were other types of resistance as well. There was sabotage, there were slowdowns, and there were just some slaves that slave owners were compelled not to go too far with. They knew who to pick on, they knew who to press, they knew what buttons to push with whom. And so there are all kinds of ways in which slaves were able to resist and to put some limits around themselves and draw some lines beyond which even slave owners dared not to transgress.
Boundaries of human decency were often ignored by masters and white overseers who preyed on female slaves, and Wessington was no exception. One slave named Airy, and possibly others, had several children by Benjamin Sims, a slave overseer. And when he was 15, Joseph Washington's son, George, allegedly fathered a child, Granville, with a teenage slave.
It is one of the most shocking aspects of slavery, and one that abolitionists pointed to consistently as evidence of the hypocrisy of any claim that it was a morally acceptable institution. Granville's story is not unique. It's quite common for enslaved people to have parents who were white and free. As one of the descendants recalled, if you were an enslaved woman, if a white man told you to lay, you had to lay down. To contemplate what that meant for individuals who were in that position, someone like Granville or his mother, think about what that would have meant for them.
For Granville, it meant living his life as an outcast of sorts, a child of two different worlds, belonging in neither. His fate was complicated further when he was appointed personal servant to the man who fathered him, but would never claim him. The spring of 1862 heralded the beginning of the end of the long, cold winter of slavery. Nashville, just 30 miles south of Wessington, became the first Confederate capital to be reclaimed by advancing Union forces. Understandably, the news spread through the Washington family, black and white, like wildfire, prompting the first of many self-emancipations. Several would eventually join the United States colored troops and fight to protect their newfound freedom, while others would help construct Nashville's Fort Negley. Tennessee's capital was second only to Washington, D.C., as the most fortified city in the nation.
After the war broke out, a number of the men were the first to leave the plantation. Some of them who had been born on the plantation and probably never left the grounds in their entire lives. So many of them came to Nashville. They later went back to the plantation, got their wives and children, and brought them to Nashville. During the war, many of them would go back and forth. The mistress of the plantation would tell Granville to tell all the slaves if they weren't going to work, that they'd have to leave, and then they would send word back by Granville to tell her that they're not going to work and they're not going to leave either. So it was very turbulent for a number of years during the war. She had a lot of run-ins with some of the former slaves, especially some of the house servants. She was constantly in squabbles with them.
Clinton and Victoria spoke to Grandma just like she was a Negro. Miss Vick is the most impudent one of all. She and Grandma are quarreling right now. The Negroes aggravate Grandma nearly to death.
Wessington was not spared from the mayhem that swept across Tennessee during the war. The Washingtons endured foraging armies, both blue and gray, as well as outlaws. One particularly violent encounter would end with an ironic twist of fate.
George A. Washington shot a horse thief who was a deserter from the Union Army. He was accompanied by another man who had went back to the outfit that he deserted from and told them that this guy on this plantation killed one of our men. So the whole outfit stormed to the plantation, put a noose around George's neck while his wife, mother, and children pleaded for his life. Granville managed to get word to a regiment of African-American troops in Springfield. They got there just in time to save George's life.
Granville, George's son, servant and now savior, would prove his loyalty time and time again. The Washingtons even entrusted him with the security of the plantation when George, fearing for his life, spent the last months of the war in New York.
The good old times will never be again. The glory has departed, and the fading light of those times shines but upon ruined homes and blasted hopes.
Jane Washington's selfish hopes for the continuation of slavery had been crushed at an enormous cost, but her mansion was far from ruin. While many homes were left smoldering in the war's wake, Wessington emerged virtually unscathed. In fact, due to wise investments made in the North, the Washingtons had never been richer. Secure in the knowledge that their former master could afford to pay them, several freedmen returned as employees or sharecroppers, but there were other reasons as well.
When someone has been a slave on a farm or on a plantation for 30 years, you know each other. Yes, you're in a new circumstance, and yeah, you do negotiate new relationships, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to suddenly betray the secret that I know about you, or that you're going to betray the secret that you know about me. The human relationships that have developed over time, that's complicated. We have all kinds of strange, ambiguous relationships with each other that have nothing to do with race. But throw race into it, and then you can understand Granville and why he says, no, I think I'll just stay right here.
Among those returning was family matriarch Jenny Washington, along with several generations of her descendants. Jenny's long road to freedom had begun more than 60 years before, and although it ended at Wessington, it was not the Wessington of her youth. No longer forced to witness her children's lives and labor being stolen from them, she could now watch with pride as they built lives of their own. Several Wessington servants, including Granville, never left at all. The loyal valet remained on the plantation until George's death in 1892, after which he moved to Nashville. Haunted by a secret hidden in plain sight, Granville had been free for 30 years, but was unable to escape the demons of his past.
To think that people to whom you were related first had enslaved you and members of your family and still saw you as a second-class citizen, someone that they could accept but only as much as they wanted to or needed to, I think that had to hurt, and I think that does show in some of Granville's last statements before he dies.
Granville Washington was born in Robertson County on January 17, 1831, a slave of George A. Washington, and was with him constantly, his body servant until after the war and long after freedom was given him. On August 22, 1898, he died by a pistol shot fired by his own hand.
Slavery is a difficult part of our nation's history, but it is a part of our nation's history, and Americans still wrestle with that as part of our national identity. What the history of Wessyngton Plantation and all of the people there helps us do is to understand it as a human experience and to contemplate what that means for us today.
The Washingtons of Wessington will live on through the efforts of John Baker Jr. in the papers, portraits, and photographs handed down through the years. And most importantly, through the lives of generations of descendants, inspired by stories of their ancestors to fully realize the promise of freedom.
We were just trying to tell the story and show how within bondage, slaves were able to build lives and sustain families. We can see how the descendants and sometimes these former slaves themselves were able to own property, were able to start businesses, go to school, build their own institutions such as churches and schools, and you get to see the story after the story.
How people lived together, how families existed, it fills in the real gaps in the story of slavery. I'm thrilled to see that when there's so much attention to the battles of the Civil War, that we're looking at the lives of people in the Civil War and the great untold story, which is the African American story.
How many of you here today know that you are a descendant of someone who lived at Wessington? I'd like for you to stand up or raise your hand. Before y'all go, I'd like to get a group picture, so don't get out of here. You're Joe Pitt?
Right.
Okay, well, good to see you. A number of people that I've come in contact, we feel like extended family because our ancestors, lived under the same conditions. So it's just like a big family reunion as I reach out and people reach out to me.
Reaching out to those long past, sharing their stories of pain and perseverance, of hardship and hope, of freedom and family.
What's going on in your mind while you're reading about this culture of which your family is so intimately a part?
It's amazing that they survived everything that they went through in plantation slavery. So they must have been undoubtedly very strong people. And I'm sure their faith in God helped them to endure those times.
The preceding program was made possible in part by the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area.